The city exhaled a plume of gray, November breath, and Leo felt it in his bones. The cold was a patient predator, seeping through the threadbare wool of his jacket, gnawing at the hollow space where a meal should have been. He huddled in the alcove of a closed bookstore, trying to make himself small, trying to become just another shadow in a city full of them. People flowed past him on the sidewalk, a river of warm coats, fragrant coffee, and purposeful strides. They were a different species. Their eyes, when they happened to fall on him, slid away without purchase, as if he were a glitch in the urban landscape, a smudge on the glass of their otherwise perfect day. Humiliation was a constant, low-grade fever. It wasn't in grand gestures but in the small, relentless dismissals. The woman who clutched her purse tighter as she passed. The man who muttered, "Get a job," without breaking his pace. The worst had been an hour ago. The warm, yeasty smell of baking bread had pulled him toward a small cafe, its windows glowing with golden light. He had stood near the vent on the side of the building, not begging, just trying to steal a moment of warmth, when the owner, a man with a stained white apron and a perpetually sour face, had burst out. "Get out of here," he'd snapped, waving a broom like a weapon. "You're scaring away my customers." Leo hadn't said a word. He had just melted back into the shadows, the man's disgust a fresh brand on his already scarred dignity. He was 17, but the streets had carved decades into his face. His reflection, caught in the dark window of the bookstore, was a stranger's, gaunt, grimy, with eyes that held the ancient weariness of a forgotten soldier. He was a ghost haunting a world that refused to see him, a silent scream in a city that had gone deaf. The ache in his stomach was a physical thing, a coiled serpent of hunger and despair. It was this ache that made everything else sharper. The biting wind, the scorn in a stranger's glance, the profound, crushing weight of his own invisibility. He was nothing, a piece of human debris to be stepped over, ignored, and swept away. That was the plain, unvarnished truth of his existence. And as the afternoon light began to fail, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Leo felt a familiar hopelessness begin to settle over him, heavy as a shroud. He closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear completely, not just from sight, but from existence itself. But the city was relentless, its sounds a constant barrage against his weary mind, and he knew there was no escape. The fragile piece of Leo's invisibility was shattered by a voice, loud and thick with liquor. Hey, little lady, where you going in such a hurry?" The voice belonged to a man who stumbled more than he walked, a large, fleshy figure in a stained windbreaker, reeking of cheap whiskey and belligerence. His target was a young woman clutching the hand of a small girl, no older than 6, who wore a bright pink coat and matching mittens. The mother quickened her pace, her body a rigid line of fear, pulling her daughter closer. But the man, Garrett, was persistent. He lurched in front of them, blocking their path, a grotesque smile spreading across his flushed face. "What's the matter? Can't a guy be friendly?" he slurred, his words a foul mist in the cold air. The tension on the sidewalk became a palpable thing. The river of pedestrians split, flowing around the confrontation, creating a wide, empty circle. It was a stage, and everyone was suddenly an unwilling audience, their gazes averted, their footsteps quickening. No one wanted to be involved. Systemic indifference was a powerful force, a collective agreement to look away. Garrett's presence seemed to suck the air from the space around him. He was a vortex of casual cruelty, and he denied the worth of the mother and child with every leering glance, every slurred word. He represented the chaos that people built walls and routines to keep out, and now that the chaos was here, their only defense was to pretend it wasn't happening. The mother's voice was a trembling whisper. "Please, just leave us alone." Her plea was a feather against a hurricane. It only seemed to amuse him. Alone? Nobody should be alone. He chuckled, his eyes fixing on the little girl, who had buried her face in her mother's coat. "Especially not a little dolly like you." He reached out a grimy hand toward the girl's head. The mother flinched back, pulling her daughter behind her, shielding her with her own body. The humiliation was thick and suffocating. She was being victimized in broad daylight, surrounded by people, yet utterly isolated. Her dignity was being stripped away, layer by layer, by a drunken brute, and the silent, watching city was his accomplice. From his alcove, Leo watched the scene unfold, the familiar coil of dread tightening in his gut. This was the world in its rawest form, the strong preying on the weak, while the comfortable looked on from a safe distance, their silence a form of consent. The man's taunts were a denial of the woman's humanity, and the crowd's inaction was a denial of their shared responsibility. Leo felt his own dismissal reflected in theirs. They were disposable. He was disposable. The only difference was the stage. The little girl's pink coat was the color of scraped knees and bubblegum, the color of innocence. It was the same shade as the one his sister, Sarah, had worn. The sight of it was a key turning a rusted lock in the deepest part of his memory. Suddenly, he wasn't on a cold city street anymore. He was back in the cramped, perpetually dim living room that smelled of stale beer and his stepfather's rage. He was 10 again, and Sarah was 5. He could feel the threadbare carpet under his knees, hear the drone of the television, see the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light slicing through the grimy window. Sarah was humming to herself, a tuneless, happy little song, as she colored in a book on the floor, her small fingers gripping a purple crayon. Her pink coat was draped over the back of a chair, a splash of impossible cheer in the oppressive gloom. His stepfather, a mountain of a man named Frank, was asleep in his recliner, an empty bottle dangling from his hand. The piece was a fragile, temporary thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold lake. Leo knew the sound of the ice cracking. It started when Frank stirred, his groan a low rumble of thunder. It continued when he saw Sarah's coloring book had slipped, one page resting on his dirty work boot. The crack became a fissure when he kicked the book across the room, his voice a gravelly roar. "What's this junk doing here?" Sarah had frozen, the crayon falling from her hand. Her happy hum died in her throat. Leo's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to be the big brother. He was supposed to protect her. He had promised her, in whispered conversations after dark, that he would never let Frank hurt her. But fear was a paralysis. It was a cold, heavy liquid that filled his lungs, his limbs, his throat. He watched, frozen, as Frank lumbered over to Sarah. He saw the terror in her wide, blue eyes as the man's shadow fell over her. He heard her tiny whimper, and he did nothing. He stayed on the floor, small and silent, praying to a God he didn't believe in that the monster would just go back to sleep. The memory was seared into his mind not with fire, but with the shame of his own inaction. He never forgot the look on Sarah's face when Frank snatched her up, her cry of pain as his fingers dug into her arm. He never forgot the sound of his mother's frantic, useless apologies from the kitchen. Most of all, he never forgot the wave of self-loathing that had washed over him, so powerful it threatened to drown him. He had run away 2 years later, not from Frank, but from himself, from the ghost of the boy who had failed to keep his promise. The streets were a punishment he felt he deserved. Every cold night, every pang of hunger was penance. He had built his quiet strength not on courage, but on the bedrock of that one monumental failure. He had vowed that he would never again stand by and do nothing while someone weaker was being terrorized. That single, searing memory was the principle that now governed his desolate existence. It was the only thing of value he had left. The pressure on the street intensified, the air growing thick and heavy. Garrett, emboldened by the crowd's passivity and the mother's fear, took another staggering step forward. His drunken amusement was curdling into something meaner, more predatory. "What's that you got there?" he snarled, his eyes locking onto the worn, one-eyed teddy bear clutched in the little girl's free hand. Before the mother could react, his hand shot out and snatched it. The little girl let out a choked cry, a sound of pure, helpless distress. "Give that back," the mother demanded, her voice rising with a desperate edge. Garrett held the bear aloft, dangling it by one leg. "You want it? Come and get it?" he taunted, a cruel grin splitting his face. He was enjoying this, feeding off their fear. The little girl began to sob openly, her small body shaking. The sound cut through the urban noise, a sharp, piercing note of misery. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people pulled out their phones, not to call for help, but to record the squalid drama. Their screens formed a sterile barrier between them and the ugliness unfolding just feet away. They were spectators at a zoo, watching a predator toy with its prey, detached and safe behind the glass of their own inaction. A man in a business suit shook his head and hurried past, his face a mask of annoyance. A group of teenagers laughed, one of them making a crude comment. Their silence wasn't just an absence of help. It was an active form of participation, a tacit endorsement of the torment. Leo felt the world slow down. Each sob from the little girl was a hammer blow against the wall of his own fear. His hands, shoved deep in his pockets, were clenched into fists. Self-preservation screamed at him to stay hidden. He was a homeless kid. He had nothing. Getting involved could mean a beating or the police or worse. He was already on the lowest rung of society. A fall from here would be into a bottomless abyss. He was hungry, he was cold, he was tired. He just wanted to survive another day. But then he saw the girl's face, streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a terror he recognized. It was Sarah's face. It was the face of every promise he had ever broken to himself. The crowd's apathy was the same suffocating silence he had once contributed to. He could stay in his alcove. He could remain a ghost. He could let this happen just like he had let it happen before. The weight of his past and the horror of the present pressed down on him, a crushing, unbearable force. He endured it for a long, stretched-out moment, the internal battle a raging firestorm. Then, a quiet, resolute calm settled over him. Penance wasn't about suffering. It was about action. He moved without thinking, his body finally obeying the command his soul had been screaming. One moment he was a shadow in the alcove, the next he was a physical presence in the center of the circle of indifference. He didn't run or shout. His steps were deliberate, quiet, as he walked directly into the space between the drunken man and the terrified family. He was a thin, ragged barrier, but he stood as if rooted to the concrete. The contrast was stark and immediate. Garrett was a large, blustering man, soft and bloated from drink. Leo was wiry, all sharp angles and hollows, but his posture held an unyielding stillness. He didn't look at Garrett at first. He looked at the little girl, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. Then he turned his gaze to the man, his expression unreadable, a blank canvas of quiet resolve. "Leave them alone," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Garrett's drunken monologue with the sharp edge of a razor. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore unbreakable. Garrett blinked, momentarily confused by this unexpected interruption from a person he hadn't even registered as existing. He squinted at Leo, taking in the frayed jacket, the grimy face. A sneer twisted his lips. "What did you say, street rat?" he spat. "Get lost before you get hurt." Leo didn't flinch. He simply stood his ground, his thin frame a human shield. He held out his hand, not in aggression, but in a simple, clear demand. Give the kid her bear back. This act of selfless dignity was more powerful than any threat. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just doing what was right, an act of pure, unadulterated principle. He was offering up his own body, his own safety, to protect strangers, to atone for a past failure in the only way he knew how. The crowd, which had been a collection of disconnected individuals, was now a single, focused entity. Every eye was on the ragged teenager who had dared to step out of the shadows. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, not just of fear, but of anticipation. Garrett's face flushed a deeper, angrier red. Being defied by the mother was one thing. Being challenged by a homeless kid was an intolerable insult to his drunken pride. He lowered the bear and took a menacing step toward Leo. "You think you're tough, you little piece of trash?" he growled, balling his fists. Leo didn't back down. He just held his ground, his gaze unwavering, a silent testament to the idea that true strength wasn't about size or volume, but about the courage to stand for something when everyone else remains seated. The shift in the crowd was subtle at first, then undeniable. It began with the phones. One by one, the small screens that had been held up to record a spectacle of humiliation were lowered. The act of filming had been a shield, a way to create distance. Putting the phone down was an admission of engagement, of presence. A woman standing near the curb gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The teenagers who had been laughing a moment before fell silent, their smirks replaced by expressions of stunned disbelief. The raw courage of the boy in the tattered jacket was a stark, uncomfortable mirror, reflecting their own cowardice back at them. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, the tone changing with every passing second. Is he crazy? Became look at that kid. He's going to get himself killed. Morphed into, he's the only one doing anything. The judgment that had been so easily cast upon the homeless kid was now turning inward. They had seen a piece of human refuse, a problem to be ignored. Now they saw a boy standing alone, defending a stranger against a brute while they, the well-dressed, the well-fed, the respectable, did nothing but watch. The mother, who had been frozen in terror, stared at Leo with wide, grateful eyes. He was a savior who had appeared from nowhere, an angel in filthy clothes. She pulled her daughter even tighter, her body trembling not just with fear, but with a dawning sense of awe. This boy, who had less than anyone on this street, was giving everything he had to protect them. The atmosphere had been transformed. The detached, almost clinical observation of the crowd had dissolved, replaced by a shared, visceral tension. They were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses. Every person on that sidewalk was now connected by the singular, brave act of one underestimated teenager. Their collective shame was a tangible force, a heavy silence that pressed in on Garrett, who now found himself the villain not just to his victims, but to the entire street. He hesitated, his drunken bravado faltering under the weight of dozens of accusing eyes. He had been performing for an apathetic audience, but the audience had turned on him. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered, not by a threat of violence, but by a simple, profound act of human decency. The world had tilted on its axis, and at its center stood a boy who had reminded them all of a truth they had conveniently forgotten. That silence in the face of cruelty is a choice, and courage is a responsibility. It began as a vibration. A low thrum felt more in the bones than in the ears, a tremor in the concrete soul of the city. The sound grew steadily, a deep, guttural rumble that swelled into a deafening roar, drowning out the traffic, the whispers, the very air itself. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day, the sound of an approaching beast. Then they appeared. Turning the corner at the end of the block was not one motorcycle, but a wave of them, a rolling tide of chrome and black leather. They moved with the disciplined grace of a cavalry charge, their engines thundering in a synchronized, intimidating rhythm. On the backs of their leather vests was the iconic, feared emblem, the death's head of the Hell's Angels. There were dozens of them, an overwhelming force that seemed to blot out the fading afternoon light. They didn't just pass by. The lead rider, a man with a long gray beard and eyes that had seen everything, raised a single gloved hand. With practiced precision, the bikes fanned out, forming a perfect, menacing semicircle that sealed off the entire section of the street. They cut their engines in unison, and the sudden, profound silence that followed the roar was more terrifying than the noise itself. The street was now their territory. They had been watching. From the smoky windows of a dive bar across the street, they had seen the whole thing unfold. They had watched the crowd's indifference, the woman's fear, the man's cruelty, and they had watched the boy. They had seen him step out of the shadows, a lone soldier taking on a battle no one else would fight. The leader swung a leg over his bike, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a solid, definitive thud. He was a man built of granite and leather, his presence radiating an aura of absolute authority. They called him Preacher, not for any religious affiliation, but for the quiet, sermon-like gravity with which he dispensed judgment. He unbuckled his helmet, his gaze sweeping over the scene, missing nothing. He saw the trembling mother, the crying child, the blustering, suddenly terrified drunk, and the thin, unwavering boy standing between them. The other bikers dismounted, forming a silent, imposing wall of leather and muscle. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their presence was a statement, a verdict. They were an old-world tribe, operating by a code that the modern world had forgotten. A code where courage was currency and respect was earned through action, not status. And on this cold, indifferent city street, they had just witnessed an act of courage so pure, so selfless, that it demanded their attention. They were not here as redeemers or angels of mercy. They were a force of nature, a brotherhood drawn to a display of honor, and their arrival signaled that the quiet drama on the sidewalk was about to have a new and final act. Preacher moved with a slow, deliberate pace that was more intimidating than any sudden rush. His boots scraped softly on the asphalt, the only sound in the unnervingly quiet street. He walked past the terrified mother and her child, offering a slight, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance. He walked right past Garrett, dismissing him as if he were a piece of litter, an insignificant obstacle. His entire focus, the full, crushing weight of his attention, was on Leo. He stopped a few feet away from the boy, his eyes, the color of storm clouds, studying him intently. He saw the worn-out sneakers, the too-thin jacket, the grime on his face. But he also saw the straightness of his back, the steady, defiant light in his eyes, the complete absence of fear. He saw a warrior. "You all right, kid?" Preacher's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together. It was not a question of pity, but a query from one fighter to another. Leo, who hadn't taken his eyes off Garrett, finally blinked and looked at the mountain of a man in front of him. He gave a small, jerky nod. "I'm okay." Just then, the mother, her composure finally breaking now that a wall of protectors stood between her and her tormentor, rushed forward. Words tumbled out of her, a frantic, grateful torrent. "He saved us," she said, her voice thick with tears, gesturing toward Leo. "That man, he was... And nobody did anything. They just watched. But this boy, he stepped in front of us. He told him to stop. He wasn't scared." Her testimony filled the silent street, painting a vivid picture of Leo's bravery. She told them about the stolen teddy bear, about how Leo had put himself in harm's way, demanding nothing, expecting nothing. Her words were the reveal, not of some hidden, heroic past, but of the profound, immediate truth of Leo's character. She gave voice to the courage that the bikers had witnessed with their own eyes. While she spoke, Garrett seemed to shrink. The alcohol-fueled bravado evaporated under the collective, silent stare of 24 bikers. He began to stammer, to blubber excuses. "It was a joke. I was just having some fun." His pathetic whimpering was met with stony silence. His judgment had already been passed. Preacher listened to the mother's entire story without interruption. When she was finished, he looked back at Leo, and a flicker of something akin to respect softened the hard lines around his eyes. He had seen countless men who talked tough, who wore the costume of strength. But here was a boy with none of the trappings, who possessed the real thing in its purest form. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. In a city full of people, the only one who had acted with honor was the one they had all deemed worthless. The arrival of a police cruiser was almost an afterthought, its siren a timid chirp in the face of the bikers' silent authority. 2 officers got out, their expressions a mixture of caution and deference as they took in the scene. They knew who was in charge here. Preacher gestured with his chin toward Garrett. "He was harassing the woman and her kid," he stated simply. It wasn't an accusation. It was a final verdict. One of the bikers, a giant of a man with a shaved head, calmly took Garrett by the arm. The drunk man offered no resistance, his body limp with fear. He was handed over to the police, who cuffed him and put him in the back of their car with a minimum of fuss. Justice had been swift, efficient, and unofficial. With the antagonist removed, Preacher turned his full attention back to Leo. The community, the onlookers who had been frozen in place, watched with bated breath. This was the moment of recognition. Preacher slowly pulled off his own thick, leather riding gloves. They were worn and scuffed, molded by years of gripping handlebars, bearing the scars of thousands of miles on the road. They were a part of him. He held them out to Leo. "Winter's coming," he said, his voice low. "Hands get cold." Leo stared at the gloves, then up at the biker's weathered face. This was more than a gift. It was a symbol. It was an acknowledgement. It was respect. Hesitantly, he reached out and took them. The leather was still warm. As he slipped them on, another biker emerged from the cafe across the street, the same one that had thrown Leo out earlier. In his hands was a plate piled high with steaming food, a thick burger, a mountain of fries. He handed it to Leo without a word. Following him out of the cafe was the owner, his face a mask of profound shame. He walked directly up to Leo, avoiding the eyes of the bikers who now flanked the boy. "Son," he said, his voice strained. I was wrong. I'm sorry." He swallowed hard. "I need a dishwasher. Someone reliable. The job's yours if you want it. Pays fair. A hot meal at the end of every shift." The offer hung in the air, a bridge being built over the chasm of his earlier cruelty. Leo, holding the plate of food, just looked at him, his expression unreadable. Preacher put a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "Go on, kid. Go eat." He gently guided Leo toward the cafe's entrance. The bikers parted to let him through. As Leo stepped into the warm, brightly lit diner, the bikers didn't follow. Instead, they turned, their backs to the cafe, and faced the street. They lined the sidewalk, a silent, unmoving guard of leather and steel, their presence a clear, unambiguous message to the entire city. This boy is protected. This place is protected. The community watched, their transformation from silent observers to respectful witnesses complete. They had just seen worthlessness redeemed, courage rewarded, and a brotherhood claim one of its own. The warmth of the diner was a physical shock, a welcome embrace after the biting cold of the street. It smelled of coffee and fried onions, the scent of life and normalcy. Leo slid into a booth by the window, the red vinyl squeaking softly beneath him. He placed the heavy plate on the table, the steam rising from the food like a prayer. For a moment he just stared at it, at the glistening cheese on the burger, the golden perfection of the fries. It was more than just food. It was salvation. It was the end of a hunger so deep and so old he had forgotten what it felt like to be full. He picked up the burger with hands now covered by Preacher's thick, warm gloves. The leather felt strange and powerful, a second skin of borrowed strength. He took a bite, and the taste was explosive, overwhelming. It was the taste of safety, of recognition, of a future he hadn't dared to imagine an hour ago. Outside the large plate-glass window, the Hell's Angels stood their silent vigil. They were an intimidating, formidable line, their dark forms stark against the neon glow of the city's evening signs. They weren't looking at him, but he felt their presence like a shield. They had created a sanctuary for him in the middle of a hostile world. He was no longer invisible. He was the center of this strange, powerful universe. He caught his reflection in the window, superimposed over the image of the bikers. He was still the same thin, weary-faced boy, but something fundamental had shifted. The hollowness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a flicker of something new. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something quieter, more solid. It was dignity. He ate slowly, deliberately, making each bite last. The cafe owner brought him a glass of water, placing it down gently on the table. He didn't say anything more, but his eyes conveyed a message of deep, humbled respect. The final image of the day began to form. The bikers, their duty done, started to move. One by one, they swung their legs over their machines. Preacher was the last to mount. He looked toward the diner window, and for a brief second, his eyes met Leo's. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a promise. Farewell. A benediction. Then, In a deafening, earth-shaking chorus, the engines roared to life. The sound was no longer a threat. It was a declaration. It was the sound of loyalty, of a code honored, of respect secured. They pulled away from the curb in a magnificent, thundering procession, their taillights a string of red jewels disappearing into the dark throat of the city. The street fell quiet in their wake, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was filled with the echo of their power, with the memory of what had transpired. The transformation was complete. The diner owner walked over and placed a clean, folded apron on the table next to Leo's plate. "You can start tomorrow morning," he said, his voice soft. 8 o'clock sharp. Leo looked down at the apron, then back out the empty window. The city lights seemed a little warmer now, a little less lonely. He pulled off one of Preacher's gloves and picked up the apron. The fabric was coarse and real beneath his fingers. He gave a quiet nod, a simple gesture that sealed his new beginning, a future earned not by asking, but by a single, selfless act of courage.